Welcome everybody to our November meeting of the Atheist Society, and we are returning to the Unitarian Hall after being locked out last month, and we have the key key code. A little bit different because I'm actually in Hong Kong, so I'm going to be experiencing the meeting from the Zoom end of proceedings. So I'll see how it goes from that situation. And welcome to James Fordor. And tonight, a very topical issue: philosophy, critical thinking, and misinformation. Did that have anything to do with the US election? All right, over to you. Thank you, James.
Cool. Thanks everyone for coming. So my name is James, as you said, and I'm doing a PhD at the University of Melbourne. So I'm in my third year, and I study cognitive science and language. But today I'm going to be talking about something that's sort of related to that, but a bit different, which is philosophy, critical thinking, and misinformation. So particularly the focus is going to be on understanding a bit more about misinformation, or why people believe incorrect or strange or bizarre things, and what we can do about it kind of practically, and also how to think about it from a philosophical point of view. So it's sort of a mixture of science and philosophy in terms of what are we covering. So we'll see how it shapes up as I go. So the fundamental question that I'm asking here is, why do people believe nonsense? And slash, what can we do about it? So why people believe nonsense? Well, there's many different reasons that people have discussed in the literature. Lack of knowledge, the desire to fit in with the community, to provide emotional comfort or an outlet for their emotional concerns, and personality and other demographic characteristics. So there's many, but what I want to focus on is a subset of those, and also what the empirical literature shows about how we can better interact with people who have sort of strange or unsupported beliefs. One thing that I found when researching for this talk is the research on this area has increased pretty dramatically only a few years ago. And you can see the graph here. This is the number of peer-reviewed articles that focused on misinformation, disinformation, or fake news, with excluding those that had a purely historical focus. And you can see from 2016, it dramatically increased. So I guess we sort of know what events that's in response to. But anyway, start with looking at one of the factors that's been identified in some of the research into this area that mitigates whether people or mediates whether people accept or don't accept belief in sort of strange ideas or unsupported ideas. And that's sort of the attention or amount of cognitive effort people are putting into processing information. So let me show you some results here. So this is from a nice review article that I found, The Psychology of Fake News. It was published a couple of years ago. And so one of the key findings that they found is just a lot of the time people are able to distinguish fake news or credible information, fake news from credible information. But it's just that they don't actually spend the time or effort to do so in many actual cases. So the graphs here show different outcomes in different studies. So each of these sort of columns of dots here is the results of a different study. And the blue represents the difference between people affirming or not affirming, so like less credible sources, or like fake news or something like that, compared to when they're engaging in high versus low cognitive levels of reflection. So it's basically how much effort people put into thinking about it. And what's interesting here is that the triangles, or I guess the diamonds, in the yellow or green, whatever that color is, they reflect the difference in whether someone accepts that information based on whether it's concordant or discordant with their partisan or ideological beliefs. So what these studies are trying to get at is, do people accept information based on whether it's consistent with their political views, or is it dependent on whether they like put effort into processing, like think about it? And at least many of these studies, essentially the point here is that the blue circle is above in essentially all of these studies. There's one where it's kind of the same, but it's above the diamond in essentially all of them. And what that means is that the effect of whether people are paying attention or putting effort into actually thinking about what they're being exposed to is much bigger than whether that information is concordant with their ideological views. And so the finding here is that ideology does matter. Like, people are more likely to accept information if it's consistent with their political beliefs or their biases. But the effect of whether they're just kind of paying attention or not is actually much larger. And so that's sort of what the study concluded, is that the effect of whether someone's reflective, whether they're actually kind of putting effort into it, is bigger than the sort of partisan bias, which is something that we don't necessarily think about as much, because we often think about it in terms of, oh, people just believe what they want to hear. But a lot of the time, people just are not really putting the effort into processing the information. So here's some more results that sort of highlight that. So this was the different study from the same review here, which tried to test this idea of an inattention model. So basically the idea is that people do have a preference to share, at least most people have a preference to share accurate information rather than like fake news or news from less credible sources. But they don't necessarily make the time or the effort, or they don't pay enough attention to think about it sufficiently. And so what they did is they actually tested people. They asked them in different conditions whether they would be likely to share or not share particular news articles that they saw, whether they would share them on social media. So that's the sharing condition here. And the other condition was they were asked to rate the accuracy of the news headlines that they were shown, or the news articles that they were shown. There was a manipulation, so there were sort of two different conditions, one with true headlines and one with false headlines, or like fake news headlines. And what it's showing here is that in the accuracy condition, when people are explicitly asked to like rate the accuracy, or like, do you think this is true or false, they're mostly pretty good. So people rate it correctly, like 70-something% of the time. But simply asked, would you share this or not? They're much less accurate. So in other words, people seem to be willing to share information, even if you ask them to think about it, they wouldn't actually rate that information as true. And it seems that a major reason for this is just that people aren't paying attention. So if you explicitly ask them, hey, if you like prompt them, do you think this is credible information? Do you think this is true? That prompt is enough to get them to think about it, even for a short amount of time, and think, oh yeah, maybe this isn't correct. But if you don't give them that prompt, or you don't explicitly ask them to do that sort of processing, then many people just sort of share something without thinking about it, basically. And so that's these two studies highlight one key finding from the literature about misinformation and fake news, is that a lot of the time, especially on social media, but this probably applies elsewhere too, is people just aren't thinking much about what they're doing. They share things because, they seem interesting, or that feels true, or it attracts their attention, or something else. And if you ask them to think about it, even if they might not be very critically minded, but even many people who aren't very critically minded are able to identify and distinguish between more and less credible sources. But it's just that they don't spend the time to do so. That, I think, highlights something that we as rationalist or critical thinkers can try to do, is to just encourage people to think a little bit more about things. That might seem a bit superficial, but some of these studies, as I've said, show that it often doesn't take much to get people to pay attention. Just a small prompt to like think about the accuracy or think about the source where this information is coming from. And that's something we can encourage people to do, just kind of in an everyday discourse as we interact with people or online. Just highlight that this is an issue and encourage people to think more about things. Okay, so that's one avenue of the literature, which is about levels of processing and attention. So let me now shift gears and talk about something else, which is science and appeals to authority. So many claims that we're interested in assessing, or areas where we're concerned about people believing in misinformation, relate to findings from science, obviously. And so we lack the time and knowledge to assess most scientific claims ourselves, and so we need to rely on scientific authority. We need to trust scientists. But the question that I'm asking is, why should we? Or what are the reasons why we should trust science? Why is science more trustworthy than relying on anecdotes, religious texts, mystical experiences, or what political pundits say, or just my own introspection and personal experiences? This is an important issue because people obviously form beliefs on the basis of appealing to a wide range of sources, and science is only one of those. If we want people to form beliefs on the basis of scientific information, then the question arises, sort of, why should they? Or can we communicate effectively about why they should trust science? And so there's been some research on this. So I'll talk a bit about research and a bit about some of the philosophical side of things as well. So one thing that's been, one aspect of this that's been highlighted by a number of studies. The point here, though, is that this particular study was looking at trust of scientific authority in the context of information about COVID-19, right, during the pandemic. And one of the issues that arose there that seems to be relevant also in climate change and other aspects is that people seem to have a misconception about the nature of science and the way science works. In particular, if people think that science is just in the business of proving a theory true or false with like a high degree of certainty, then when they see conflicting information, so different scientists saying different things or different studies showing different findings, then that can they perceive that as undermining the credibility of science. Because again, their understanding is that scientists should be telling us what's true and what's false, and sort of that's all it is, right? That's, I would argue, a fairly superficial and overly simplistic understanding of what science is. Science provides us with different evidence and different models for thinking about how things work, and very often evidence is going to be complicated because it depends on the time and place where it was collected or how the question was framed and things like that. And so it's not uncommon for there to be different studies that come to conflicting results depending on exactly how they tested the question. Also, some studies, even if they're peer-reviewed studies, some are better designed than others, right? And so just because information is scientific doesn't mean that it sort of should all be treated as equally authoritative or equally plausible. But the point is that if people don't have that kind of understanding of science, then they may regard appeals to scientific authority as not very credible, because scientists are always disagreeing with each other, or one study comes out and says one thing and then the next study says the other thing, so we should just sort of ignore it all. That seems to be what some people think. And so that highlights an important issue, that it's important to communicate to people about how science actually works, at least a little bit more detail, and explained better as to why science can be trusted, or in what ways it's appropriate to trust science. Oh, yes, okay, so this other study here, this was from the same paper actually, another interesting finding was that this study was looking at people's attitudes towards science and their levels of trust in science. And they asked people a number of questions about their attitudes. And the thing that I want to focus on here is they found that the level of experience people had with science didn't predict much at all about how much they would trust in science. So in other words, I don't know exactly how they defined experience with science. I'm not sure if that was like studying at school or university, or it was like reading scientific articles or something like that. I think it's maybe a combination of these things. But the point is, more simple exposure to scientific information or interaction with scientific ideas wasn't enough to lead to higher amounts of trust in science. And, you know, there's various, I don't know that the paper was able to determine exactly why this is the case, but we can speculate that it could be that people who have an interest in areas that are relevant to science, examples could be like vaccinations or climate change, or health information or other things like that, they may engage in or expose themselves to a lot of scientific information, but not necessarily trust that information, or only trust it very selectively. And so the point is that that merely exposing people to more scientific information or more news articles or whatever is not necessarily sufficient to improve people's trust in science. We need to do a bit more than simply throw science articles at people, so to speak, or expose people to more science. We need to be able to explain better and highlight why science should be trusted and what aspects make science trustworthy. So these results highlight that there's more to say about there's more to do about improving the public's trust in science than simply expose people to science or tell people what science finds. Rather, we need to talk a bit more about why science is trustworthy and what about the scientific process makes the results trustworthy, and how to think a bit more about what science is actually doing. And so I've just, on this slide here, I just highlight, oh, is there a question?
Having signed papers which are double checked, found the conclusion. The believability of all sorts of studies is completely disarrayed. In fact, people are just making up data. You know, people are just Because it just sort of sounds somehow sort of plausible, but come on, why couldn't people be skeptical?
Okay, yes, thank you for that comment. So for those online, the comment was that there have been a number of, I think there may be just two issues here. One is about studies failing to replicate, and another is about actual fabrication of data, which are slightly different issues. And yeah, so both of these have become more widely publicized in recent years, particularly in psychology. There's the so-called replication crisis, but this has also been discussed in other fields. And there have been a number of high-profile cases of data fraud. Again, particularly in social psychology, it seems. I'm aware of a number of cases there. But anyway, and so this highlights issues where this highlights a good point where people, hear about this, and that casts the whole scientific enterprise into ill repute, right? Why should people trust science if there are these high-profile cases? And that highlights a general issue. Maybe I'll skip this slide actually, and talk about why we should trust science. And so the point that I was drawing at before is that it's not really sufficient to just tell people that they should trust science because, well, for a start, that's an appeal to an authority, right? Now, there are appeals to authorities that are legitimate, but simply telling someone that they should accept a given authority rather than another is not really very convincing to most people, and it's not really philosophically, I think, very well grounded either. So what we want to do, ideally, is communicate what it is about science, what it is about the process of science that allows us to have trust in science. And to the point that was made before, it's not what we don't want to say. We do not want to say, or we shouldn't say, that scientists never do things wrong, right? That they're always virtuous, right? That they never make up data or that they never misrepresent their results. Because obviously this does happen, right? Now, there's an empirical question as to how often we think that this happens. And that's something that is an important thing to study. Instead, what we want to focus on, I think, is not that scientists never do anything wrong, because that's obviously not true and kind of silly if anyone thought that. But maybe that is sometimes how scientists present themselves, but obviously that's self-serving. Nor should we argue that scientific results always replicate. In fact, the idea that this is sort of what I was talking about before, that people have a naive idea that any scientific result should be considered as sort of authoritative. And then if there are conflicting scientific results or certain results don't replicate, then that in some way undermines the whole process. But I would argue that that represents a misunderstanding of the nature of science. The point of science is that it's a cumulative exercise in developing and testing models and acquiring new evidence. So along the way, many studies are going to find things as spurious and are going to go down dead ends. So there may be results that are spurious for a whole bunch of reasons, and there are methodological challenges associated with really any discipline. And like the replication crisis in psychology has highlighted a number of these where there were practices such as using too small sample sizes or something called p-hacking, where people use statistical techniques inappropriately. And really, so the value of science, or the trustworthiness of science, at least from my point of view, and others have written about this too, it doesn't come from any one study or the idea that a single study is authoritative or the idea that scientists are sort of superhuman in never doing anything wrong. Rather, it comes from the nature of science as an open intellectual endeavor. Scientists don't need to sign up to any statements of faith, unlike, say, many religious organizations or political organizations, and evidence is presented for public evaluation and comment in journal articles. And there's an increasing push, obviously, towards things like open access articles and publicly available data and code to help make that public ability to critique and analyze and reanalyze results, more easier to do. Another important aspect of science and the method of science is science always takes a critical standpoint and requires evidence. Many fields, such as, well, arguably in religion or in pseudoscience, in like fields of pseudoscience or just sort of general culture and religious movements, they just take a very credulous viewpoint, and they don't necessarily have clear standards of evidence that are required. But in science, nothing is sacred or beyond doubt. Now, it's true that there are general assumptions that are made in different disciplines, and things that are regarded as well established. And so you're generally going to have pretty good evidence in order to overcome established methods or established or viewpoints that are taken as well evidenced. But there are many, many examples throughout the history of science where we see that even very well established or very widely accepted viewpoints or theories have been overturned. And this is because of the self-correcting mechanisms of science. So findings that cannot be replicated over time eventually become suspect, because other labs try to build on, or other researchers try to build on the results or the methods of the initial findings, and eventually they'll find that they're not able to replicate them. The research doesn't go anywhere. It becomes a paradigm for research that doesn't generate findings. And so those sort of research programs are eventually abandoned because they're not productive. So these sort of self-correcting mechanisms of scientists testing and building upon other researchers' findings and methods and theories ultimately lead to the discovery and correction, or at least iterative correction, of mistakes. And in fact, this is what we've seen even with recent issues such as findings failing to replicate, or even in the extreme cases of fabricated data. These are almost always discovered by scientists who are attempting to critique or replicate the work. And so that is, in my view, not evidence that science isn't working. It's evidence that science is working. That's exactly how it's supposed to happen. So the point is then that this is something that is important to communicate so that people can have a better and more realistic understanding of how science works and the reasons why science is trustworthy, because of it being an open intellectual endeavor that takes a critical viewpoint, requires evidence, and of the self-correcting mechanisms, and not because of the idea that scientists are above reproach, or that every scientific study is sort of taken as authoritative. So I might skip this example here because I think that we want to move on to, going back and forth here, the third point. So I've talked so far about two ideas. One is that often when people are evaluating evidence, we're evaluating like sources or news articles or things like that, they don't really pay very much attention or give very much thought to it. And this is one reason why misinformation spreads, is just because people aren't taking the time. And then the second point that I talked about is that one reason that people can have mistrust of science and scientific findings is because of an overly simplistic understanding of how science works or what science is, in terms of just delivering certain statements of fact and with certainty, rather than a self-corrective and iterative process of accumulating evidence. So the third thing that I want to talk about is a little bit more abstract perhaps, but we'll see if I can articulate the point. This is about coherence and worldviews and explanations. Let me sort of articulate what I mean here. So a worldview, in the way that I'm using the term, is a set of fundamental beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. And so, although many people don't necessarily think through this carefully or have a very well articulated set of propositions or ideas that they could tell you, nevertheless, most people do have some kind of worldview, wherever exactly they picked it up from, or how it's developed. One important factor in this sort of worldview is that when people perceive there to be contradictions in their worldview, this often leads to something called cognitive dissonance, where people feel uncomfortable and they want to sort of resolve that contradiction, or at least perceived contradiction. And this can lead to belief revision. So in other words, when people identify potential conflicts in their own worldview, they become uncomfortable and seek to resolve that conflict in some way. Now, the thing is, there's many ways that we can do that. One way that you can, let's say you encounter some evidence that seems to be contrary to your worldview, you may modify your worldview to incorporate that evidence, or you may simply reject the evidence, or the argument, or whatever it is. And the thing is that either can be appropriate depending on the circumstances, because sometimes evidence is not relevant, or has not been collected very well, or it's not informative, right? So sometimes it's appropriate to reject evidence, but it's not always going to be. So, important thing here is we want to think about how do people respond to new evidence or new arguments, new considerations that they come across that are potentially contradictory or in tension with their accepted viewpoints, with their worldview. And this is relevant, obviously, to challenging misinformation or belief in fake news, pseudoscience, and other such things, because one of the sort of oldest and most common methods is to sort of do what's called debunking, right? You just say, oh, well, this thing that you thought, that's actually wrong, right? And here's why, or here's the evidence. And just explain that people are incorrect, or that the thing that they believe is wrong, right? There have been a number of studies looking at the efficacy of this sort of debunking, and one of the key things that I want to highlight there is that simple debunking is often not very effective, like basically telling someone something is wrong. And one of the reasons for that is because people don't think about things in terms of just like a list of, people don't store information as like a list of facts that they list as like true or false. They think about things in terms of narratives and explanations and how it fits into their broader worldview. So let me explain a little bit here in terms of one study that looked at providing that looked at debunking and one major variable that affected the effectiveness of debunking. And they found that well-argued, detailed debunking message is more effective in reducing misinformation than like shorter, less detailed ones. And in particular, they argued that it seemed that in order to convince participants in the study to modify their views, there needed to be enough information and enough clarity about what the alternative was in order for people to form a new viewpoint, a new understanding of whatever the issue was. So it's not enough just to tell someone, at least much of the time, it's not enough to just tell someone, hey, that thing is wrong. You need to tell them what they should believe instead. You need to explain it so that they can form a new representation in their minds, or a new understanding of whatever the issue is. And if you provide, let me rephrase that. You need to provide enough detail of that so that it's something the person can kind of remember and understand. Otherwise, it's kind of just an out of context factoid that like someone says that thing you believe is wrong. There's not really much to do with that. And so often people just sort of reject that new evidence and stick with the beliefs that they already have because it fits in with their worldview. It fits in with their understanding of other things. Let me give another passage from the same study that looked at debunking. And this second one here is what I want to emphasize here. The more detail that was provided, the more people were able to sort of remember the debunking and the more likely they were to accept it. It seems that the key variable here was whether people were able to like remember and understand the debunking and whether that provided them with an alternate way to understand whatever the issue was, right? Rather than just being told that something was wrong. Instead, what is important is that they're able to form a new understanding so that they can replace their current way of thinking about things with a different way of thinking about things. Because that's often how people change their beliefs. They don't just sort of discard a belief. What we do is replace a belief with something else. But beliefs don't exist in isolation. As I've argued, they exist in the context of a worldview, an interconnected web of beliefs. So you need to provide a sort of a narrative and explanation that's comprehensible to the person. Obviously, it has to fit their level of background knowledge. And that is more effective at being able to displace misinformation rather than just sort of telling people that something is wrong or not providing enough detail that they can understand. One of the difficulties is that many people are not motivated to think about things a different way. So if they have a set way of thinking about something, and they encounter conflicting information, they may reject, or conflicting arguments or conflicting viewpoints, they may simply reject that as wrong because it's not what they think. Part of the challenge is being able to communicate to people and encourage people the value of thinking about things differently and of acknowledging that there are other ways of viewing things. Because often, in order to change a belief, you need to be able to see things in a different way, as I was arguing before, a different viewpoint, a different explanation, a different understanding. And then you can then think about it in two different ways, like, okay, here's one way of thinking about it, here's the other way, and then think more holistically about what are the kind of pros and cons, what are the arguments for and against, rather than just the way that we sometimes think about it as, oh, this person believes the wrong thing, so we want to try to debunk that. But if you just take one belief in isolation, what you say is probably not going to make much sense to them because you're coming from a different viewpoint and you're not articulating something that presents an alternative. You're just telling them what they believe is wrong. You're not meeting them where they're at with their own web of beliefs and their own worldview. So some of the ideas that I want to encourage in terms of how to think about this is that challenging a single belief is often not very effective. Instead, what we need to do is present an alternative interpretation or an alternative explanation for whatever the thing is. The second point is that we need to provide enough detail and explanatory coherence to make the alternative attractive. So don't just say this is wrong, but say, in fact, this is the correct information, and then you give an appropriate amount of detail. Now, that obviously is a balancing act. If you give too much detail, people will disengage or they won't remember it, and you do need to tailor that to whomever you're interacting with or whatever your target audience is. But that is a very important factor as well, giving enough but not too much information. Another thing that I think is valuable is to be able to ask probing questions that highlight tensions within someone's worldview if we're seeking to change that. Because as I mentioned before, if people identify apparent tensions or contradictions in their set of beliefs, then that can often lead to cognitive dissonance, a feeling of discomfort, and a desire to change at least one or more beliefs. Now, you don't necessarily know how people are going to respond to that, but asking them questions that help them to identify where some of those some of the limits or the tensions within their worldview might be, can be helpful in encouraging them to think through these issues. Again, rather than just telling them that particular facts or particular beliefs are incorrect. Another thing that I think is quite valuable is that is thinking about or is trying to understand what core values people hold. But many people have sort of things that are very core, very important to them. And if they feel that these core values are threatened by some belief change or some revision that you're trying to encourage, then they may reject whatever you're saying just on that basis that you're threatening key values. So one thing that you can do is try to, or at least this is sometimes useful, I think, is to try to show how that person's core values are not necessarily threatened by the belief change. Now, this is not always possible. Sometimes the belief change will threaten the core values that they have necessarily, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's the case that people just think that it will, but if you frame the issue differently, you may show how that is not necessarily challenged. One of the things that's common in terms of belief in climate change, just to give an example of sort of alternative explanations, is people feel that it is threatening to the idea of like progress. So they may think that, moving to like giving up fossil fuels or putting restrictions on energy production is in some way anti-progress or is in some way a move towards socialism. These are some concerns that people have. Whether that may or may not be a valid concern depending on the exact political context, but what I just want to highlight here is that we can frame the issue differently. It's not necessarily the case that belief in climate change, it's just not true that belief in climate change entails a belief in socialism or abandonment of technology or anything along those lines, right? There may be people who believe those combination of views, but that's not an entailment, right? So we can explain, well, that's one way to look at it, but there are other ways to look at it as well. You can think about restricting pollution as actually a way to, for example, enhance personal liberty because it restricts the extent to which polluters are harming other people. And so if that's an important value, you can frame it in those terms. Again, just as an example, the point is that when you're communicating to someone who has a core value that they feel is threatened by something that you're trying to persuade them of, rather than just try to sort of ram that thing down their throats, so to speak, you can try to identify what their core values are and then articulate the point that you're trying to make in a way that promotes or is consistent with those core values. And again, that's not always going to be possible, but in many cases, I think it can be possible if we just think about things in a bit of a different way. So that's an encouragement to, think more carefully about whom we're trying to direct or who we're trying to interact with or who we're trying to direct our message to, and think about what they value and then how we can articulate things in a way that is going to be persuasive to them. So let me just conclude now with a bit of a summary about what I've been talking about. So first of all, when people accept misinformation or belief in pseudoscience and fake news and such things, very often that's not just due to a lack of information. The sort of provision of information model is sort of pretty widely rejected these days. Lack of information is part of it, but there's many other things going on as well. And so we need to think deeper about it than just telling people stuff. One factor that I talked about at the start is that it's important to encourage people, in an appropriate way, in an appropriate context, to think carefully and pay more attention about things when they're engaging with information. And often this can come in the form of even just a very small prompt, like in the example of the study that I mentioned, asking people to think about, is this likely true or false? Or asking people to think about the source of information. And we can do that in an everyday context in people we interact with. And there's also ways that I was reading a bit about how some of the social media companies are looking at ways of doing this in terms of small nudges on their platforms. I don't know how successful that would be, but it's something to bear in mind, I think, that a lot of the time people are busy and they have other things to think about, and a small prompt to actually just think about something a bit more can actually be helpful. The second thing that I talked about is trust in science. And I talked about how it's important to not just argue that we should trust science or tell people that science is trustworthy, but we need to explain a bit more about why science is trustworthy and what aspects of the scientific process make it trustworthy. And so people can understand a bit more about the scientific process and how science generates knowledge, and not just think about it as an authoritative store of knowledge, which it isn't, but rather as an open and self-correcting process. I then talked about the process of rethinking views by providing different coherent explanations. So not just trying to tell someone that something they believe is wrong, but rather providing an alternate explanation that is appropriate to their level of understanding, that allows them to form a new sort of set of beliefs and connections that they can then make sense of and remember, which is more effective than just telling them that isolated beliefs are incorrect. And another aspect of that is framing things or emphasizing aspects of how the belief change is not necessarily going to be a threat to their existing values, that in fact they can accept, that they can retain their core values and still believe in whatever it is that we're trying to communicate. So that's all I have for today. So that was a sort of summary based on a combination of some scientific findings and some sort of philosophical thinking. So hopefully there were some interesting ideas in there for you.